The vast emptiness of space had become a second home to Commander Orion Cross. A decorated soldier of the United Earth Federation, he had seen more distant star systems than he could count. Yet, despite his years of service and the countless battles he'd survived, there was one thing Orion couldn't outrun: the memories of his lost daughter, Anya. His latest mission seemed straightforward: escort a scientific research team to Valeria 7, a remote jungle planet on the edge of the galaxy. The mission's goal was to study the planet's unique flora and fauna, but Orion knew better than to trust a mission brief. Valeria 7 had recently become a hotspot for skirmishes between human colonists and the native Valerian species, a mysterious, reclusive race known as the Sylvani. As his starship, the Aurora's Edge, descended through the dense atmosphere of Valeria 7, alarms suddenly blared. "Captain, we're under attack," shouted Lieutenant Hale from the navigation console. Orion's eyes flicked to the viewscreen. An array of sleek alien fighter ships, their dark hulls shimmering in the planet's green-tinted atmosphere, darted toward them with predatory precision. The Sylvani were known for their agility in aerial combat, and these fighters were no exception. "Evasive maneuvers, Hale. Shields at maximum." Orion barked, gripping the command chair as the ship lurched violently to the side. Explosions rocked the Aurora's Edge as the alien ships unleashed a barrage of plasma fire. Sparks flew from the control panels, and warning lights flashed ominously. Orion's heart pounded as he watched the shield levels drop rapidly on his display. "We've lost engines 1 and 2, Commander," reported Hale, panic creeping into his voice. "We're going down." Orion gritted his teeth. There was no way to avoid a crash. "Brace for impact," he yelled as the ground rushed up to meet them. The starship plummeted through the dense canopy of the jungle, the impact shaking Orion to his core. Darkness enveloped him as debris rained down, and the world went silent. When Orion came to, everything hurt. He could feel blood trickling down the side of his face, and the acrid smell of burning metal filled his nostrils. He groaned, forcing himself to sit up. The bridge was a mess, the consoles were shattered, and sparks danced from exposed wires. Of the crew, only a few bodies stirred, the rest motionless. "Lieutenant Hale?" Orion called out, coughing through the smoke. There was no response. Ignoring the pain, he grabbed his emergency pack and made his way to the exit hatch, stumbling over wreckage. Outside, the thick jungle swallowed the remains of his once proud ship. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the eerie calls of unseen creatures. Alone in the hostile environment, Orion knew his first priority was survival. His wrist communicator was useless, jammed by the dense magnetic fields that surrounded the planet. He couldn't call for help. If there were any other survivors, they were scattered, and he had no way of finding them. Orion checked his supplies: a damaged blaster, a half-empty medkit, and a handful of protein rations. It would have to be enough. He had to find water, shelter, and a way to repair his communicator, but he was also wary of the Sylvani forces that had ambushed him. As he trudged deeper into the alien jungle, the bioluminescent plants glowed softly, lighting his way. Strange, unblinking eyes watched him from the shadows, but nothing attacked. He remained on high alert, his every step calculated. After hours of trekking, he came upon a small clearing where a stream trickled through moss-covered rocks. Exhausted, he knelt down to drink, grateful for the cool water. But as he filled his canteen, he heard it again, that faint, mournful cry. It sounded like a child's voice, echoing through the jungle. Orion's instincts told him to ignore it and keep moving. Valeria 7 was known for its predatory creatures, many of which used mimicry to lure prey. But the sound was so heart-wrenching, so filled with genuine despair, that he couldn't ignore it. Clutching his blaster, he cautiously followed the sound through the thick underbrush. The cries grew louder, more desperate, until he emerged into a small grove. There, curled up against the trunk of a massive, twisted tree, was a small figure. At first, Orion thought it was a child, but as he drew closer, he realized it was something else entirely. The creature had smooth, blue, translucent skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Its eyes were large, silver, and filled with fear. It was covered in cuts and bruises, its tiny form trembling. The alien girl looked up at him, her eyes widening in terror. She tried to scramble away, but she was too weak. Orion lowered his blaster slowly, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a gesture of peace. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl watched him warily, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was clearly scared out of her mind, but there was no aggression in her gaze, only fear. Orion approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. He reached into his pack and pulled out a protein bar, unwrapping it before placing it on the ground and backing away. The little alien hesitated, then, driven by hunger, she crawled forward and snatched the bar with trembling hands. As she devoured it, Orion couldn't help but notice the extent of her injuries. She was malnourished, her limbs too thin for her frame. She looked up at him again, her silver eyes filled with something that struck him. Was it desperation? Or something more profound? "Where's your family?" he asked, knowing she likely couldn't understand him. But instead of responding, the alien girl's eyes welled up with tears, and she made a soft, pleading sound. She reached out with a trembling hand, grasping the edge of his torn uniform. The gesture was so human, so heartbreakingly familiar, that Orion felt a pang in his chest. He thought of his own daughter, Anya, who had died years ago during a colony outbreak. The pain of that loss had never truly left him, and seeing this helpless child stirred emotions he had long buried. The alien girl spoke in a language that was nothing more than soft, melodic murmurs to his ears. But Orion didn't need to understand the words to recognize the plea in her eyes. She was alone, scared, and desperately seeking protection. Kneeling down beside her, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "All right, kid. I don't know who you are or how you ended up here, but I'll help you," he said softly. "I promise." The little alien girl's eyes widened, and without warning, she threw herself into his arms, clutching him tightly. Orion stiffened, momentarily shocked, but then he relaxed, wrapping his arms around her frail form. In that moment, in the middle of a hostile jungle on an alien world, Commander Orion Cross found a spark of hope, something he thought he had lost forever. Because for the first time in years, he felt like a father again. And no matter what dangers lay ahead, he knew one thing: he would protect this little alien girl with his life. The jungles of Valeria 7 were far from forgiving, but they were especially merciless to those unprepared for their hostile embrace. Commander Orion Cross knew this all too well. As dawn broke over the dense canopy, he awoke to find the little alien girl, Lyra, nestled beside him, fast asleep. Her blue, iridescent skin glimmered softly in the faint sunlight filtering through the trees. She was so fragile and vulnerable, curled up like that, clutching a piece of his torn uniform as if it were her lifeline. Orion sighed, feeling the weight of his newfound responsibility pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had promised to protect her, but in this unforgiving terrain, that was easier said than done. Orion carefully rose to his feet, trying not to wake her. He needed to scout the area, find food, and ensure there were no immediate threats nearby. The jungle was alive with the chirps, growls, and distant shrieks of its native creatures, sounds that constantly kept him on edge. Before he could take more than a few steps, he heard a soft rustling behind him. Lyra was awake, her wide silver eyes tracking his every movement. She tilted her head in confusion as he adjusted his gear. "Morning, kid," Orion muttered, kneeling beside her. He pointed to himself. "Orion," he said slowly, enunciating each syllable. Then he pointed at her questioningly. "What's your name?" The little alien blinked, her lips moving soundlessly. She tapped her chest with a delicate hand. "Lyra," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like the rustle of leaves. "Lyra, huh?" Orion repeated, nodding. "All right, Lyra. We need to move." It's not safe to stay in one place for too long. Though she likely couldn't understand his words, Lyra seemed to grasp the urgency in his tone. She nodded hesitantly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and trust. Orion extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so small and malnourished. The day wore on as they trekked through the dense underbrush, the heat becoming more oppressive with each passing hour. Orion's military training kept him alert, eyes scanning for any signs of danger. Lyra, despite her initial timidness, was surprisingly quick and agile. She moved almost silently through the jungle, her bare feet scarcely making a sound as she followed closely behind him. Orion realized that she had an innate connection with the environment around her. Whenever they came close to dangerous plants or hidden pitfalls, she would tug on his sleeve and shake her head vigorously. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but after she saved him from stepping into a nest of venomous insects, he started to trust her instincts. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep purple and red, they found shelter in a hollowed-out tree trunk. The jungle came alive with nocturnal creatures, their glowing eyes peering out from the darkness. Orion knew the night would be treacherous. The predators of Valeria 7 were known to be most active after sundown. He lit a small fire using what remained of his emergency flares, just enough to keep the predators at bay without drawing too much attention. Lyra watched the flickering flames with a mix of awe and fear. It seemed she had never seen fire before. "Here, eat this," Orion said, breaking a protein bar in half and handing it to her. Lyra took it cautiously, sniffing it before taking a tentative bite. Her eyes lit up, and she devoured the rest quickly. As they sat in silence, the fire casting dancing shadows around them, Orion couldn't help but study her. Who was she? And why was she alone in this jungle? The Sylvani were a reclusive species, known for their secretive ways, but he had never heard of them abandoning their young. He pointed to her once more, tapping his chest. "Orion," he said again, and then pointed at her. "Lyra." Lyra's eyes sparkled as she nodded enthusiastically. "Orion," she tried, her pronunciation soft and lilting. "That's right," he said with a faint smile. "You're getting the hang of it." Lyra's face lit up with a shy grin, and for a moment, the heavy weight on Orion's heart lifted. But the moment was short-lived as a distant howl echoed through the jungle. Lyra's eyes widened with terror, and she instinctively clung to his arm. "Stay close," he whispered, drawing his blaster. His instincts told him it was only a matter of time before the Sylvani soldiers who had shot down his ship would come searching for him. They couldn't stay in one place for long. The next few days blurred into a constant struggle for survival. Orion and Lyra moved during the early mornings and late evenings, avoiding the midday heat and the predators that hunted under cover of darkness. Orion had managed to scavenge some edible plants and a few small animals, while Lyra showed him which parts of the jungle were safe to traverse. Despite the language barrier, they developed an unspoken communication. Lyra would tug on his sleeve or point with urgency whenever she sensed danger, and more often than not, she was right. Orion was astounded by her instincts. It was as if she could feel the pulse of the jungle, reading its rhythms in a way that he, even with his years of training, could not. One afternoon, as they were crossing a shallow river, Lyra stopped abruptly. She looked around, her silver eyes narrowing. Before Orion could ask what was wrong, she bolted toward the riverbank, pulling him with surprising strength. "What is it, Lyra?" he asked, but she just pointed frantically at the water. That's when he saw a school of small, nearly invisible fish with razor-sharp fins darting just beneath the surface. One of them grazed his boot, and the leather was instantly shredded. If they had waded any deeper, those fish would have torn them apart. "You saved us again," Orion said, giving her a grateful smile. Lyra beamed at the praise, her small chest puffing with pride. But their fragile peace was shattered one evening when they stumbled upon a long-abandoned Sylvani outpost. It was overgrown with vines and moss, but it was unmistakably of alien origin. Orion hoped to find something useful, maybe a working communicator or supplies, but as they searched, Lyra froze. Her eyes widened, and she let out a soft, fearful whimper. Orion turned to see what had frightened her and saw a symbol etched into the wall, a series of spirals and lines that glowed faintly in the dim light. "What is it, Lyra?" he asked, but she only shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. She tugged at his sleeve, pulling him away from the structure. Orion's instincts told him they needed to leave. And fast. But it was too late. A sharp crackle filled the air, followed by the distinct hum of an energy weapon powering up. Orion spun around, blaster in hand, just as a group of Sylvani soldiers emerged from the underbrush, their dark armor blending seamlessly with the jungle. Lyra screamed, clinging to Orion as the soldiers closed in. He fired off a few shots, taking down one of the attackers, but he was outnumbered. The Sylvani warriors advanced, their weapons trained on him. "Run, Lyra!" Orion shouted, pushing her away. But she refused to leave him, clutching his arm even tighter, her eyes wide with terror. Realizing that they were cornered, Orion knew he had only one chance. He threw down a smoke grenade, enveloping the area in a thick, blinding cloud. Grabbing Lyra by the arm, he bolted into the jungle, hoping the confusion would buy them some time. They ran through the dense foliage, the sound of Sylvani soldiers pursuing them growing fainter. But Orion knew they were far from safe. Breathless and exhausted, they finally stopped by a small waterfall to catch their breath. Lyra was trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks. Orion knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Hey, it's all right," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "I won't let them take you." Lyra looked up at him with those silver, tear-filled eyes. "Pa. Pa," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Orion's heart clenched. He had lost his own daughter years ago, but in that moment, staring into Lyra's eyes, he felt something he hadn't in a long time, the fierce, protective instinct of a father. He pulled her into a tight embrace. "I'm here, Lyra. I won't leave you. I promise." And as the jungle around them roared with the sounds of approaching enemies, Orion knew he had found something worth fighting for once more. The dense jungle of Valeria 7 seemed to close in around them, every tree and shadow a potential threat. Commander Orion Cross and the young alien girl, Lyra, were constantly on the move, never staying in one place for long. The Sylvani soldiers were relentless in their pursuit, driven by an unseen force that Orion couldn't quite understand. They seemed more interested in capturing Lyra than killing him, and that only deepened the mystery of who she was and why they wanted her so badly. Orion knew their luck would run out if they didn't find a safe place to regroup and plan. The meager supplies he had salvaged were running low. Lyra, though brave beyond her years, was growing weaker each day. The constant running, the lack of proper food, and the fear etched on her face wore on Orion's already frayed nerves. He couldn't keep pushing her like this, she was just a child. As dawn broke on their fourth day of running, Orion and Lyra found refuge in a cave hidden behind a thick curtain of vines. Orion carefully examined the entrance, making sure it wasn't a trap or a den for some carnivorous creature. Satisfied, he led Lyra inside, the cool darkness offering a brief respite from the oppressive heat outside. "Here, kid. Sit down," he said softly, guiding her to a flat rock. She collapsed with a weary sigh, her thin frame trembling. Orion rummaged through his pack, producing the last of their rations. He handed her a piece of dried meat, which she nibbled on hesitantly. She was clearly not used to human food, but hunger overpowered her reluctance. As she ate, Orion sat beside her, his mind racing. He needed a plan. They couldn't keep running forever. His military instincts told him they needed to find higher ground, a vantage point where he could try to get a clear signal for his damaged communicator. But with Lyra slowing down, their pace was becoming dangerously sluggish. "Lyra," Orion began, pointing to the communicator strapped to his wrist. He mimicked the motion of sending a signal into the sky. We need to find help. Humans. Understand? Lyra's large silver eyes followed his movements intently, and though she didn't fully grasp his words, she nodded. Then, to Orion's surprise, she began to draw in the dirt with her finger. She sketched what looked like a series of jagged peaks, topped with strange symbols Orion didn't recognize. "What's this?" he asked, intrigued. Lyra pointed to the drawing, then gestured upward. "High place," she said in her broken attempt at the human language. "Safe." Orion's eyes narrowed as he studied the crude map. She was trying to tell him about a mountain range. If they could reach it, they might be able to find a spot high enough to broadcast a distress signal. And if Lyra said it was safe, it might be their best chance. "All right," he said, nodding. "We'll head for the mountains. But we have to move fast." Lyra gave him a determined look, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Orion couldn't help but feel a swell of admiration for her resilience. He reached out and ruffled her hair, earning a shy smile in return. They set off at dawn, making their way toward the distant peaks that loomed like dark sentinels over the horizon. The jungle grew thicker and more treacherous as they advanced. Lyra, despite her small size, was incredibly agile, darting through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs with ease. She would often stop abruptly, her head tilting as if listening to some silent song of the forest, then guide Orion away from hidden dangers. But the Sylvani were closing in. Orion could feel it, the jungle was too quiet, the air too tense. The Sylvani were masters of stealth, able to blend into their surroundings with near invisibility. He knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up. By the afternoon of their second day of travel, they reached the foothills of the mountain range. The air was cooler here, and the dense jungle gave way to rocky terrain and sparse vegetation. Lyra seemed to perk up, her eyes shining with renewed energy. "We're close, aren't we?" Orion asked, watching as Lyra's gaze darted eagerly toward a distant cliffside. She nodded enthusiastically, pointing toward a narrow path that wound its way up the steep incline. But before they could start their ascent, a sudden, sharp cry pierced the air. Orion's heart sank as he turned to see Sylvani soldiers emerging from the jungle, their sleek, dark armor glinting in the dimming light. There were at least a dozen of them, weapons raised and eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. "Go, Lyra!" Orion shouted, pushing her forward. "Get to the mountains. I'll hold them off." Lyra hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes, but Orion's fierce glare left no room for argument. "Run," he barked, drawing his blaster and firing at the advancing soldiers. The jungle erupted into chaos. Plasma blasts seared the air, and Orion's blaster grew hot in his hands as he fired shot after shot. But the Sylvani were relentless, their movements fluid and coordinated. For every soldier Orion took down, it seemed like two more took their place. Lyra, despite her fear, didn't waste Orion's sacrifice. She darted up the rocky path, her small form quickly disappearing into the shadows of the mountains. But as Orion continued to fight, he realized they were hurting him, pushing him away from Lyra. They weren't trying to kill him, they wanted to separate him from the girl. With a final, desperate burst of energy, Orion threw a smoke grenade and sprinted after Lyra, using the cover to break through their lines. The soldiers hesitated, momentarily disoriented, and that gave him just enough time to catch up to her. When he reached her, they were both gasping for breath. Lyra's eyes were wide with terror, but she held onto his arm with a grip far stronger than her fragile appearance suggested. "We have to keep moving," Orion panted, pulling her along. "The peak isn't far." They scrambled up the rocky path, the terrain growing steeper and more treacherous. As they neared the summit, Orion's wrist communicator finally picked up a faint signal. His heart leapt with hope. If he could just boost the signal, maybe, just maybe, they could call for help. But as he tried to adjust the settings, Lyra suddenly grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with panic. "No. No," she whispered, pointing up at the sky. Orion looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw it, a sleek Sylvani airship hovering silently above them. It had been waiting for them, tracking their every move. "We're out of time," Orion muttered. "We need to activate the beacon now." He grabbed the small portable beacon from his pack, his fingers fumbling with the controls. Lyra stood beside him, her eyes locked on the approaching airship. The hum of its engines grew louder, the wind whipping through their hair. Come on, come on." Orion gritted his teeth, praying that the beacon would work. He slammed his fist against the side, and at last, a green light blinked to life. A burst of static crackled through his communicator, followed by a garbled voice. "This is the Starfire. Commander Cross, do you copy?" Orion's heart leapt. "Starfire, this is Cross. I have a civilian with me, requesting immediate evac. Coordinates locked." But before he could transmit the full signal, the airship unleashed a barrage of plasma fire. Orion shielded Lyra with his body as the ground exploded around them. The shockwave knocked them off their feet, sending them tumbling down the rocky slope. Dazed and bleeding, Orion struggled to his feet. The airship was closing in, preparing for a final assault. He turned to Lyra, who was staring up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "I promised I'd protect you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm not going to break that promise." With the last of his strength, he activated a flare from his pack, launching it high into the air. The brilliant light shot up into the sky, a desperate beacon against the encroaching darkness. The roar of engines filled the air as the Starfire descended from the clouds, its guns blazing. The Sylvani airship hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden arrival of the human rescue team. Orion grabbed Lyra, pulling her toward the dropship as it hovered above them, a hatch opening. "Hold on, Lyra," he shouted as they were lifted into the air by a grappling beam. As they were pulled aboard, the Sylvani soldiers below opened fire, but it was too late. The Starfire shot into the sky, leaving the jungle and their pursuers far behind. Lyra collapsed into Orion's arms, trembling. He held her close, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. For now, they were safe. But he knew the battle was far from over. Whatever secrets Lyra carried, the Sylvani would stop at nothing to get her back. And Orion was now more determined than ever to protect the little girl who had become his family. As the Starfire soared through the atmosphere, Orion looked down at Lyra, her wide silver eyes filled with trust. "Don't worry, kid," he whispered. "We're in this together. I won't let them take you." And this time, he meant every word. The Starfire streaked through the atmosphere, leaving the dense jungles of Valeria 7 behind. Commander Orion Cross leaned against the bulkhead, clutching Lyra close to his side. Her small frame trembled in his arms, her wide, silver eyes still clouded with fear. The roar of engines, the acrid smell of burning plasma, and the shriek of distant explosions filled the air. But for now, they were safe. "Commander Cross, report." The gruff voice of Captain Arya Vanek came through the ship's intercom. Orion knew her well, they had served together in countless skirmishes across the galaxy. Orion tapped his communicator. "Captain Vanek, this is Cross. I've got a civilian with me, an alien child. She's the reason the Sylvani were hunting us. We need to get her out of here, fast." There was a brief pause on the other end, then the sound of Vanek's voice softened. "Understood. But you've stirred up a hornet's nest down there, Commander. We're picking up multiple enemy ships closing in. We'll do our best to hold them off, but you need to reach the base as soon as possible." Orion grimaced. The Starfire was fast, but not fast enough to outrun a squadron of Sylvani fighters. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. In the medical bay, Orion gently set Lyra down on one of the examination tables. Medics immediately rushed to check her vitals, but Lyra clung to him, refusing to let go of his hand. "It's all right, kid. These people are here to help," he said softly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her tear-streaked face. But her grip only tightened, her eyes pleading. She didn't trust anyone except him, and for good reason. Her entire world had been torn apart. The lead medic, a no-nonsense woman with graying hair, shot Orion a frustrated look. "We need to run a scan on her, Commander. If she's the key to why the Sylvani were so desperate to capture her, we need to know." Orion hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But I stay with her." The medic relented with a sigh. As they began the scan, Lyra's eyes widened in panic. She whimpered softly, her small fingers digging into Orion's hand. He leaned down, whispering soothing words in her ear. "Hey, it's okay. I'm right here," he said. "Nothing's going to hurt you. I promise." The scanner emitted a soft hum, bathing Lyra in a pale blue light. The medics watched the display closely, their expressions growing more serious with each passing second. "What is it?" Orion demanded, his nerves fraying. The medic's face was grim. "Commander, this child, she's not just an ordinary Sylvani. There's something unique about her biochemistry." She pointed to the screen, where strange, luminous patterns pulsed beneath Lyra's translucent skin. "These readings, they match the energy signatures of the ancient Sylvani relics we've been trying to decode for years." Orion's heart sank. The Sylvani were known to possess ancient technology far beyond anything humanity had developed. If Lyra was somehow connected to those relics, it would explain why the Sylvani were willing to send an entire army after her. The medic continued, her voice urgent. "She's not just a child, she's the key to unlocking the Sylvani's most powerful technology. If they get their hands on her..." Orion didn't need to hear the rest. If the Sylvani reclaimed Lyra, they could potentially harness her unique abilities to power their war machines, turning the tide of the galactic conflict in their favor. He knelt beside Lyra, who was staring at the glowing patterns on the screen with wide, frightened eyes. "Lyra," he said softly, "do you understand what they're saying?" Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes shimmering with tears. Special. My people need me," she whispered haltingly, struggling to form the words. "But they hurt me." Orion's heart ached. This little girl was caught in the middle of a war she couldn't possibly understand. And now, she was being used as a pawn by both sides. He made a decision in that moment, one that would change both their lives forever. The alarms blared as the Starfire shook violently, enemy fire impacting its shields. The Sylvani ships had caught up, and they were closing in fast. Captain Vanek's voice crackled over the intercom, laced with urgency. "Commander Cross, we can't hold them off much longer. We need to jump to hyperspace or we're done for." Orion made his way to the bridge, Lyra clutching his arm as they navigated the chaotic corridors. The crew was working frantically to prepare for a jump, but the Sylvani ships were jamming their systems. "Captain, we need to boost the signal to cut through the interference," Orion said, his mind racing. "I have an idea, but it's risky." Vanek's eyes narrowed. "I'm listening." Orion knelt down beside Lyra, speaking softly. "Lyra, I need your help. I think you can amplify our signal, like how you guided me through the jungle. Can you do that?" Lyra hesitated, looking at the frightened faces of the human crew around her. But when she met Orion's gaze, she nodded, trusting him completely. Orion led her to the main control panel, placing her small hands on the transmitter. "Just like before, Lyra. Focus on the signal. Feel it." She closed her eyes, her face scrunching in concentration. The lights on the control panel flickered, then began to glow brighter. The ship's systems, which had been faltering, suddenly roared back to life. "It's working," one of the technicians shouted. "We're cutting through the jamming field." But the Sylvani were not giving up. The lead enemy ship began to charge its main weapon, aiming directly at the Starfire. Orion's eyes widened. If they fired, they would be obliterated. "Vanek! We need that jump now," he shouted. Vanek slammed her fist on the console. All hands, prepare for hyperspace. But even as the engines roared to life, the Solvani ship unleashed its devastating energy beam. Orion had only seconds to act. He wrapped his arms around Lyra, shielding her as the ship shuddered violently. The world around them seemed to implode as they were thrown into hyperspace, the stars stretching into thin lines before everything went black. When Orion came to, the Starfire was drifting through the calm void of space. The hyperspace jump had saved them, but the ship was heavily damaged. The crew worked feverishly to stabilize the systems, but for now, they were safe. Lyra was still in his arms, her breathing shallow but steady. She opened her eyes slowly, looking up at him. "Oh. Orion, we safe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He smiled down at her, relief flooding his heart. "Yeah, kid. We're safe." Captain Vanek approached, her expression softer than Orion had ever seen. "You did it, Cross. You saved us all. And that little girl." She shook her head in amazement. "She's something special." Orion nodded. "Yeah, she is." He looked down at Lyra, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective love. "She's my daughter now, Vanek. And I'm going to protect her, no matter what." Vanek raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Well, you'll have your work cut out for you. The Federation will want to study her, figure out how she amplifies those signals. You might not have much say in the matter." Orion's jaw tightened. "Let them try," he said coldly. "Anyone who wants to take her will have to go through me first." Back at the human base, Lyra was given a proper medical examination, and Orion was finally able to breathe. But the threat was far from over. The Solvani would not give up so easily, and Orion knew they would come for her again. But for now, as he watched Lyra laugh for the first time in days, playing with a small holographic toy one of the engineers had given her, Orion felt a glimmer of hope. He would protect her with his life. Because she wasn't just an alien girl anymore. She was his daughter. And as the stars glimmered outside the viewport, Commander Orion Cross swore that whatever it took, he would be the father she deserved, a guardian, a protector, and above all, a family. No matter the cost.